The Venezuela reality the U.S. can't control. Let me take you back to March 18th of this year, not because it was a day of dramatic headlines, but because it was the day the ground beneath U.S. policy in Venezuela shifted in ways Washington still refuses to acknowledge. That afternoon, a Russian cargo plane landed at Maiquetía International Airport outside Caracas, carrying not just the usual diplomatic personnel or humanitarian aid, but something far more: a team of military advisors and, according to intelligence sources I've spoken with, advanced electronic warfare systems designed to harden Venezuela's air defenses against potential U.S. strikes. The flight wasn't announced, the cargo wasn't declared, and the State Department's response was a carefully worded statement about Russian destabilization that did everything except admit the obvious: Moscow had just drawn another red line in America's backyard, and Washington had no good options left. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of great power competition and failed states, and I can tell you what's happening in Venezuela isn't just another crisis. It's a microcosm of America's accelerating loss of control over a world that no longer bends to its will. The official narrative, repeated ad nauseum by think tanks, cable news pundits, and administration officials, is that Venezuela is a simple morality, a corrupt dictatorship propped up by Russia and China, starving its people while looting its resources, and all the U.S. needs to do is apply more pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, maybe a little covert action, and the regime will collapse like a house of cards. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's wrong. Not just incomplete, not just oversimplified, fundamentally, dangerously wrong. And the longer Washington clings to it, the more likely we are to stumble into a conflict we don't want, with consequences we haven't begun to imagine. Let's start with what they want you to believe. The story goes like Venezuela is a failed petrostate, its economy in ruins after 2 decades of socialist mismanagement. Nicolas Maduro, the illegitimate successor to Hugo Chavez, rules through brute force, rigged elections, and the support of a corrupt military elite. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions targeting everything from oil exports to gold sales to squeeze the regime financially, while recognizing opposition leader Juan Guaidó as the country's legitimate president. The goal? A peaceful transition to democracy, the restoration of Venezuelan prosperity, and the removal of Russian and Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere. It's a clean, satisfying story, one that fits neatly into America's self-image as the defender of freedom and the rules-based order. And it's backed by some undeniable: Venezuela's GDP has collapsed by over 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. More than 7 million people have fled the country, creating one of the worst refugee crises in the world. Maduro's government has jailed opponents, tortured dissidents, and presided over sham elections. By any measure, Venezuela is a humanitarian catastrophe. But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. The data doesn't support the idea that sanctions alone will force Maduro from power. In fact, the opposite appears to be happening. Since the U.S. imposed its most aggressive sanctions in 2019, including a ban on Venezuelan oil exports, the regime has not only survived but adapted. How? By deepening its ties with Russia, China, and Iran, all of whom have stepped in to fill the void left by U.S. pressure. Russia's state oil company, Rosneft, has helped Venezuela evade sanctions by rebranding its oil and selling it to Asian markets. China has extended billions in loans, secured by future oil deliveries, effectively turning Venezuela into a client state. And Iran, facing its own U.S. sanctions, has sent tankers of gasoline to Venezuela in exchange for gold, creating a sanctions-busting alliance that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The result? Maduro's government is still standing, the military remains loyal, and the opposition is fractured and demoralized. If the goal of U.S. policy was to isolate Venezuela, it has failed spectacularly. Instead, it has pushed Caracas into the arms of America's adversaries. What's really happening is Venezuela has become a battleground in the new Cold War, a proxy conflict where the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower calling the shots. And the more Washington tries to force the issue, the more it reveals its own declining leverage. Let me tell you something that should be obvious but isn't: the U.S. no longer has the economic, military, or diplomatic dominance it enjoyed in the 1990s. The unipolar moment is over. Russia and China aren't just passive observers in Venezuela, they're active players, and they're playing to win. Moscow sees Venezuela as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a way to project power right up to America's doorstep. Beijing sees it as a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative, a source of oil and minerals, and a test case for its ability to challenge U.S. hegemony. And both see U.S. policy in Venezuela as a sign of weakness, a superpower so desperate to maintain its dominance that it's willing to destabilize a country of 28 million people in the hope of scoring a geopolitical win. Now let me be, I'm not defending Maduro. His government is authoritarian, corrupt, and responsible for immense suffering. But if we're being honest about geopolitics, morality has never been the primary driver of great power behavior. The U.S. has a long history of supporting dictators when it suits its interests, from Pinochet in Chile to the Shah in Iran to the Saudi monarchy today. The difference now is that America's ability to shape outcomes in its favor is diminishing, and its adversaries are exploiting that weakness. The real question isn't whether Maduro is a bad guy, it's whether U.S. policy is making things better or worse. And the evidence suggests it's making them worse. Let's out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Venezuela isn't just a country in crisis, it's a case study in the limits of American power in the 21st century. For decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can reshape the world in its image, that economic pressure and military might can force other nations to bend to its will. But that assumption is collapsing under the weight of reality. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't spread democracy, they spread chaos. The color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia didn't create stable U.S. allies, they created frozen conflicts and Russian pushback. The Arab Spring didn't usher in a new era of freedom, it ushered in civil wars and authoritarian resurgence. And in Venezuela, the U.S. is learning the same lesson all over. You can't force a country to change by squeezing it from the outside. All you can do is create space for its enemies to move in. This brings us to the military dimension, because if there's one thing that should keep policymakers up at night, it's the growing risk of miscalculation. The U.S. has already come dangerously close to conflict with Russia over Venezuela. In 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Guaido as president and began funneling aid to opposition forces, Russia responded by sending military personnel to Caracas, including a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries, according to U.S. intelligence. The message was, if the U.S. tries to overthrow Maduro, Russia will fight back. And it's not just Russia. Iran has sent military advisors to Venezuela, and China has provided intelligence and cyber support. The U.S. Navy has conducted freedom of navigation operations off Venezuela's coast, and the Pentagon has drawn up contingency plans for a potential intervention. But here's the thing about military: they sound simple until you actually have to execute them. Venezuela isn't Grenada or AMA. It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that, while poorly equipped, is deeply entrenched and loyal to the regime. Any U.S. intervention would require a massive commitment of forces, and even then, the outcome is far from certain. Remember Iraq? Afghanistan? Libya? The U.S. has a long history of winning wars and losing the peace. In Venezuela, the risks of escalation are even higher, because this isn't just about removing a dictator, it's about confronting Russia and China in their own backyard. And that's where the domestic political dimension comes in. Because let's be, U.S. policy in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about politics. Florida is a swing state, and Venezuelan exiles are a powerful voting bloc. Every administration since Obama has felt the pressure to take a hard line against Maduro, not because it's the smartest policy, but because it's the politically safest one. Trump recognized Guaido in 2019 in part because it played well with his base. Biden has kept the sanctions in place, despite growing evidence that they're not working, because he can't afford to look soft on socialism. And let's not forget the role of the foreign policy establishment, the think tanks, the lobbyists, the career diplomats who have staked their reputations on the idea that regime change in Venezuela is just one more push away. The result is a policy that's more about domestic posturing than actual strategy. And that's dangerous, because when you're dealing with nuclear-armed adversaries like Russia, posturing can quickly turn into conflict. So where does this leave us? Let's consider the scenarios. The best-case outcome, from a U.S. perspective, is that Maduro is overthrown in a popular uprising, the military defects, and a democratic transition begins. The probability of this happening? low, and getting lower by the day. The opposition is divided, the military is still loyal, and the regime has shown it can survive even the most crippling sanctions. The most likely scenario is that Venezuela remains a frozen conflict, a failed state propped up by Russia and China, with the US maintaining sanctions and occasional covert operations, but no real path to resolution. The worst-case scenario? A miscalculation. A US airstrike on a Russian or Iranian target in Venezuela. A Russian counterstrike. A rapid escalation that neither side wants but neither can control. The probability of this? Higher than you might think, especially as the US and Russia continue to clash in Ukraine and the Middle East. Now, I know what some of you are, but we can't just let Maduro get away with this. We can't let Russia and China carve out a sphere of influence in our hemisphere. And I agree, up to a point the US does have legitimate interests in Latin America. But the question is how to protect those interests without making the situation worse. And that brings me to what I believe is the only viable path, a realist approach that accepts the limits of American power and focuses on containment rather than regime change. Here's what that looks like. First, the US needs to stop pretending that sanctions alone will force Maduro out. They won't. Instead, it should focus on targeted measures that hurt the regime's inner circle without punishing the Venezuelan people. Second, it needs to engage with Russia and China not to legitimize Maduro, but to manage the conflict and prevent escalation. That means back-channel diplomacy, confidence-building measures, and a willingness to negotiate. Third, it needs to support the Venezuelan opposition in a way that doesn't set them up for failure. That means more than just rhetorical support, it means helping them build institutions, train leaders, and prepare for the long game. And fourth, it needs to accept that Venezuela may not become a democracy anytime soon. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the reality. The goal should be stability, not regime change. I know this is controversial. I know it sounds like appeasement. But let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying: the most dangerous policies are the ones that ignore reality. The US tried to remake the Middle East in its image, and it failed. It tried to isolate Russia, and it failed. It tried to contain China, and it's failing. Venezuela is just the latest example of a superpower that's overstretched, overconfident, and out of ideas. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start pursuing policies that actually work. In the end, the story of Venezuela isn't just about one country. It's about the end of an era, the era of American dominance. The US can't control Venezuela. It can't control Russia. It can't control China. And the more it tries, the more it risks repeating the mistakes of the past. The question isn't whether the US should give up on its ideals, it's whether it can afford to keep pursuing them in a way that makes the world more dangerous, not less. The answer, I believe, is no. So here's my final: the next time you hear a politician or a pundit talk about Venezuela as if it's a simple problem with a simple solution, ask, what are they not telling you? Because the reality is far more complicated and far more dangerous than the official narrative would have you believe. And in a world where the stakes are this high, the last thing we need is more wishful thinking. We need clear eyes, hard choices, and a willingness to accept that the US can't fix every problem. Not anymore. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a political or economic problem, it's a geopolitical fault line. And like all fault lines, when it shifts, the tremors are felt far beyond its borders. The US has spent years treating Venezuela as a contained crisis, a regional headache to be managed with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and the occasional covert operation. But that's not how great powers lose influence. They lose it when they fail to see the bigger picture, when they mistake a symptom for the disease. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't Cuba. It's not Nicaragua. It's not even Iran. It's a country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, sitting on the doorstep of the United States, in a hemisphere where China and Russia have been steadily extending their footprint. Yet, Washington still acts as if this is just another Cold War proxy battle, as if the only thing standing between Maduro and democracy is a well-placed sanction or a sternly worded UN resolution. That kind of thinking is not just outdated, it's dangerous. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela is now a testing ground for a new kind of great power competition, one where the rules aren't written by the US anymore. Russia and China didn't create Venezuela's crisis, but they've certainly exploited it. Moscow has kept Maduro's regime afloat with loans, arms sales, and a steady stream of military advisors, including, according to U.S. Southern Command, Wagner Group mercenaries embedded with Venezuelan forces. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president and the U.S. recognized him, Russia responded by sending 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Caracas in a show of force. That wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a "this is our sphere of influence now." China, meanwhile, has played the long game. While the U.S. was busy imposing sanctions, Beijing was quietly buying up Venezuela's oil at discounted rates, extending billions in loans, and embedding itself in the country's infrastructure. The Chinese-built satellite control center in El Sombrero, the deep-water port in La Guaira, the fiber-optic network stretching across the country, these aren't just commercial projects. They're strategic assets. And they're not going anywhere, no matter who's in power in Caracas. In 2023 alone, China imported over 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, making it the regime's single largest customer. That's not charity. That's leverage. Now, you might be so what? Let them have Venezuela. It's a basket case anyway. But that's exactly the kind of short-term thinking that got us here. Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a choquipo. It sits at the crossroads of the Caribbean and South America, a stone's throw from the AMA Canal, the U.S. Gulf Coast, and some of the world's most critical shipping lanes. In 2020, when Maduro's regime signed a military cooperation agreement with Iran, allowing Iranian warships to dock in Venezuelan ports, it wasn't just a provocation. It was a signal that the rules of the game had changed. Iran, a country the U.S. has spent decades trying to contain, now has a foothold in America's backyard. And it's not just Iran. Hezbollah operatives have been active in Venezuela for years, using the country as a base for fundraising, money laundering, and even training. The DEA has documented cases of Venezuelan officials facilitating drug shipments to the U.S., with some of the proceeds allegedly funding Hezbollah's operations in the Middle East. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. It's a documented reality. In 2020, the U.S. indicted Maduro and several of his top officials on narco-terrorism charges, accusing them of using cocaine shipments to flood the U.S. market and fund their regime. The indictment wasn't just about drugs, it was about the intersection of crime, terrorism, and state power. And it's not just Venezuela. The same networks that move drugs from Colombia through Venezuela to the U.S. also move weapons, money, and people for groups like Hezbollah and the Sinaloa cartel. This is what modern conflict looks: not armies clashing on a battlefield, but shadowy networks operating in the gaps between states. So where does that leave the U.S.? The Pentagon has been sounding the alarm for years. In 2021, Admiral Craig Fowler, then the head of U.S. Southern Command, testified before Congress that Venezuela was becoming a launching pad for asymmetric threats against the U.S. He wasn't talking about a conventional military invasion. He was talking about cyber attacks, drug trafficking, and the kind of hybrid warfare that Russia and China have perfected. And yet, despite these warnings, the U.S. response has been scattershot at best. Sanctions have crippled Venezuela's economy but failed to dislodge Maduro. Military options are off the table. No one in Washington wants another Iraq or Afghanistan. And diplomatic efforts have been half-hearted, with the U.S. oscillating between engagement and isolation without a clear strategy. Here's the thing about great power: it's not just about who has the biggest military or the most advanced technology. It's about who can shape the environment to their advantage. Russia and China understand this. They don't need to invade Venezuela to win. They just need to make sure the U.S. can't control it. And right now, they're doing exactly that. Take the recent military exercises. In 2023, Venezuela and Russia conducted joint naval drills in the Caribbean, just miles from U.S. territorial waters. The message was: we can operate here, and there's nothing you can do about it. Meanwhile, China has been extending its presence in the region, not just in Venezuela but in AMA, Cuba, and Nicaragua. In 2022, Nicaragua's Daniel Ortega signed a security agreement with China, allowing Chinese military vessels to dock in Nicaraguan ports. That same year, China and Cuba reached a deal to establish a joint military training facility on the island, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a coordinated effort to erode U.S. influence in its own hemisphere. And yet, the U.S. response has been reactive, not strategic. When Russia sent those bombers to Venezuela in 2019, the U.S. scrambled to respond, sending a Navy destroyer to shadow them. When China exited its port access in the region, the U.S. issued stern warnings but did little else. This is the problem with a superpower that's overstretched and under pressure. It can't afford to ignore threats, but it can't afford to overreact either. So it ends up doing just enough to look tough but not enough to actually change the dynamic. Let me be, I'm not advocating for a new Cold War in Latin America. That would be a disaster. But I am saying that the U.S. needs to wake up to the reality that Venezuela is no longer just a failed state, it's a geopolitical battleground. And if Washington doesn't start treating it as such, it's going to lose more than just influence. It's going to lose control of its own neighborhood. The question is, what can the U.S. actually do? The answer isn't more sanctions or more covert operations. Those have been tried, and they've failed. The answer is a mix of containment and engagement, a strategy that acknowledges the limits of U.S. power while still protecting its core interests. That means working with allies in the region to counter Russian and Chinese influence, not just through military cooperation but through economic investment and diplomatic pressure. It means rethinking the sanctions regime to target the regime's enablers, not the Venezuelan people. And it means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the U.S. needs to find a way to coexist with him, at least for now. This isn't surrender. It's realism. The U.S. doesn't have to like Maduro to deal with him. It doesn't have to abandon its values to protect its interests. But it does have to recognize that the world has changed, and that the old playbook doesn't work anymore. Venezuela is a warning sign. If the U.S. can't manage a crisis in its own backyard, how can it expect to compete with China and Russia on the global stage? The truth is, the era of American dominance is over. The U.S. can't control Venezuela. It can't control the Middle East. It can't even control its own border. But it can still shape the world in its favor if it's willing to play the long game, accept hard truths, and stop pretending that every problem has a simple solution. Venezuela isn't just a test of U.S. policy. It's a test of U.S. leadership. And right now, the U.S. is failing. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't being fought in the halls of the U.S. State Department or the Kremlin strategy rooms, it's being waged in the streets of Caracas, Maracaibo, and Valencia, where the regime's survival depends less on foreign patrons than on its ability to maintain a delicate balance of repression, patronage, and controlled chaos. The domestic political dimension is where the U.S. has consistently misread the situation, assuming that economic pressure alone would force Maduro out, or that the opposition could simply outlast him. Neither has worked, and the reason is Maduro isn't just a dictator clinging to power. He's the architect of a system designed to survive precisely the kind of external and internal pressures the U.S. has thrown at it. Let me explain why this matters. Since 2019, when Juan Guaidó was recognized by the U.S. and dozens of other countries as Venezuela's legitimate interim president, the opposition has been stuck in a cycle of high-stakes gambits that never quite pay off. The strategy was delegitimize Maduro internationally, starve his regime of cash, and wait for the military to turn. But here's the uncomfortable: the military never turned, the cash never fully dried up, and Maduro's international legitimacy, while weakened, was never truly broken. Why? Because the regime's domestic power structure isn't built on ideology or even loyalty. It's built on survival. Take the military, for example. The U.S. has sanctioned hundreds of Venezuelan officers, including the entire top brass of the armed forces, assuming that cutting them off from the global financial system would force them to abandon Maduro. But what Washington failed to account for was how deeply the military had been integrated into the regime's economic lifeline. The armed forces don't just control security, they control the ports, the gold mines, the food distribution networks, and even the cryptocurrency operations that have kept the regime afloat. In 2020, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned the head of the military's economic arm, the Compañía Anónima Militar de Industrias Mineras, Petrolíferas y de Gas, for its role in illicit gold trafficking. But by then, the military was already diversifying into other revenue streams, including the sale of passports and visas to foreign nationals, reportedly including Middle Eastern investors with questionable ties. The sanctions hurt, but they didn't cripple. They just forced the regime to get more creative. Then there's the opposition. The US has bet heavily on Guaidó and his allies, but the opposition's biggest weakness isn't Maduro's repression, it's its own fragmentation. Since 2019, the anti-Maduro coalition has splintered into at least three major factions, each with its own strategy and foreign backers. There's the hardline group led by Leopoldo López and Maria Corina Machado, who still believe in a maximalist approach, no negotiations, no concessions, just regime change. Then there's the more pragmatic wing, including figures like Enrique Capriles, who have pushed for dialogue with the regime, arguing that incremental change is better than none. And then there's the third group, the one that's been quietly making deals with Maduro's inner circle, trading political concessions for economic relief. The problem? None of these factions can agree on a unified path forward, and the US has struggled to pick a horse to back. Here's where the domestic politics get really messy. In 2021, Maduro allowed the opposition to participate in regional elections for the first time in years, a move that was widely seen as a tactical retreat. The opposition won a handful of governorships and mayoralties, but the real victory was Maduro's. He got to claim that Venezuela was a functioning democracy, even as he stacked the Electoral Council with loyalists and banned his most popular opponents from running. The US condemned the elections as a sham, but the damage was done. The opposition was divided over whether to participate, and when they did, they legitimized a process that was never going to be free or fair. It was a classic case of regime-controlled liberalization, a tactic the Soviets perfected in the 1980s, where you allow just enough dissent to relieve pressure without actually ceding power. Now, fast forward to 2024. The opposition is gearing up for another presidential election, and the question is whether they'll even be allowed to compete. Machado, who won the opposition's primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote, has been barred from running by the regime. The US has responded by easing some sanctions in exchange for promises of a free and fair election, but let's be honest, no one in Washington actually believes Maduro will allow a vote he can't control. The real question is what happens after the election. If Maduro wins again, will the US recognize the result? If the opposition boycotts, will they lose what little leverage they have left? And if there's another round of protests, will the military crack down even harder than they did in 2017, when security forces killed over 100 demonstrators in a matter of months? This is where scenario projections get interesting. There are three plausible paths forward, and none of them are good for the US. The first is the status quo plus Maduro survives, the opposition remains divided, and the regime continues to muddle through with a mix of repression and economic liberalization. This is the most likely outcome, at least in the short term. The regime has already shown it can adapt, allowing limited private enterprise, easing price controls, and even letting the dollar circulate alongside the bolivar to stabilize the economy. Inflation, which hit a staggering 1,000,000% in 2018, has dropped to only 200% in 2023, according to the Venezuelan central bank. That's not progress, but it's enough to keep the streets quiet. The US might keep sanctions in place, but without a unified opposition or a credible military threat, there's no real pressure for change. The second scenario is the controlled transition. Maduro steps down or is sidelined, but the regime remains intact under a new figurehead, someone like Diosdado Cabello, the powerful National Assembly president and longtime Chavista hardliner. This could happen if the military decides Maduro is more of a liability than an asset, or if Russia and China push for a more palatable leader to protect their investments. The US might see this as a victory, but it wouldn't be. The system would remain the same, just with a different face. The opposition would be co-opted or sidelined, and the US would be left with the same. Do you engage with a regime that's still authoritarian, or do you keep up the pressure and risk pushing Venezuela further into the arms of Moscow and Beijing? The third scenario is the collapse, economic meltdown, mass protests, and a military crackdown that spirals into civil conflict. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Venezuela's oil production has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The country's infrastructure is crumbling, and the regime's ability to pay its security forces is increasingly dependent on illicit revenue streams. If those dry up, whether because of sanctions, corruption, or sheer incompetence, the military might fracture, with some units defecting while others double down on repression. The US would be faced with to intervene to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, or stay out and watch Venezuela become another Syria or Libya. Neither option is appealing. Here's the none of these scenarios give the US what it wants, which is a stable, democratic Venezuela that doesn't threaten its interests. The best-case scenario for Washington is a slow, managed decline of the regime, where Maduro or his successor is forced to make real concessions in exchange for sanctions relief. But even that would require the US to accept a reality it has so far refused to, that the opposition alone can't win, and that the military is the real kingmaker. The US has spent years trying to bypass the generals, but the generals are the ones who decide whether Maduro stays or goes. So where does that leave us? The US needs to stop thinking of Venezuela as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a reality to be managed. That means three things. First, the US needs to stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to the opposition. The days of Guaidó as the great hope are over. The opposition is useful as a pressure point, but it's not a government in waiting. The US should engage with all factions, not just the hardliners, but without giving any of them a blank check. That means conditioning support on unity, not just rhetoric. Second, the US needs to rethink its sanctions strategy. The current approach has failed because it's too broad. Instead of targeting the entire economy, the US should focus on the regime's enablers, the military officers, the crony capitalists, the foreign bankers who launder their money. And it should pair sanctions with offer relief in exchange for real reforms, like the release of political prisoners or the reinstatement of banned opposition candidates. Third, the US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not yet. That doesn't mean recognizing him as legitimate, but it does mean finding ways to coexist without surrendering. The US has done this before, with Cuba, with Vietnam, even with the Soviet Union. It's not pretty, but it's better than the Venezuela that spirals into chaos, dragging the entire region down with it. The bottom line is Venezuela is a test of whether the US can adapt to a world where it no longer calls all the shots. The old playbook, sanctions, regime change, military threats, doesn't work anymore. The US can't control Venezuela, but it can still shape the outcome. The question is whether it's willing to do what it takes. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of US hegemony in its own backyard. For decades, Washington treated Latin America as a chessboard where it could move pieces at will. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was an assumption. But the world has changed, and Venezuela is the clearest proof yet that the US can no longer dictate outcomes south of the Rio Grande. The question isn't whether Maduro will fall, it's whether the US can accept that its influence is now just one variable among many, and not the most important one. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. Venezuela is a test case for how the US will handle a multipolar world where regional powers, China, Russia, Iran, even Turkey, are no longer content to play by Washington's rules. Take China's role in Venezuela. Since 2007, Beijing has loaned Caracas over $60 billion, most of it secured by oil. That's not charity, it's a strategic bet. China isn't just propping up Maduro out of ideological solidarity, it's locking in long-term access to Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest in the world. And unlike the US, China doesn't care about human rights or democratic backsliding. It cares about supply chains. That's a reality the US can't wish away with sanctions or moralizing. Then there's Russia. In 2019, when the US was pushing for regime change, Moscow sent in Wagner Group mercenaries and military advisors to secure Maduro's grip. The message was if the US tries to topple Maduro, Russia will make sure it's messy. And it worked. The US blinked. That's not weakness, it's pragmatism. But it's also a sign that the rules of the game have changed. The US can no longer assume that its military or economic dominance will automatically translate into political outcomes. The world is too interconnected, too multipolar, for that kind of thinking. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has two options in Venezuela, and neither is ideal. The first is to double down on the current approach: more sanctions, more isolation, more hope that economic pressure will eventually break the regime. But as we've seen, that hasn't worked. The Venezuelan economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013, yet Maduro is still standing. Why? Because sanctions don't just hurt the regime, they hurt the people, and the regime uses that suffering to rally support. It's a classic authoritarian playbook, and the US keeps falling for it. The second option is to pursue what I'd call managed coexistence, a strategy that acknowledges Maduro's staying power while still pushing for incremental change. This isn't about recognizing his legitimacy, it's about recognizing reality. The US could start by easing sanctions on specific sectors, like food and medicine, in exchange for the release of political prisoners, the reinstatement of opposition candidates, or the reopening of independent media. It could also engage with the military directly, offering amnesty or economic incentives to officers who defect. That's not appeasement, it's diplomacy. And it's a lot more effective than hoping for a sudden collapse. Now, I know what some will, but if we engage with Maduro, aren't we just legitimizing a dictator? That's a fair concern, but it misses the point. The US has engaged with dictators before: Stalin, Mao, Pinochet, the Saudis, and it will again. The goal isn't to make Maduro a good guy, it's to prevent Venezuela from becoming a failed state that exports chaos across the region. A collapsed Venezuela means more refugees, more drug trafficking, more criminal networks, and more opportunities for China and Russia to extend their influence. That's a price the US can't afford. Let's talk about the alternatives. The most dangerous one is military intervention, which some in Washington still whisper about. But let's be a US invasion of Venezuela would be a disaster. The country is twice the size of Iraq, with a population that's deeply divided but still fiercely nationalistic. The military would resist, and even if the US succeeded in toppling Maduro, it would inherit a broken country with no functioning institutions. That's a quagmire waiting to happen. The US learned that lesson in Iraq and Afghanistan. It shouldn't need to learn it again in Venezuela. The other alternative is to simply walk away, to declare Venezuela a lost cause and focus on other priorities. But that's not realistic either. Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a key US ally, and its instability has already spilled over into Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador. The US can't ignore a country of 28 million people that sits on the world's largest oil reserves. That's not just bad policy, it's bad strategy. So where does that leave us? The US needs a grand strategy for Venezuela that's rooted in realism, not wishful thinking. That means three things. First, accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term, and plan accordingly. Second, use sanctions and diplomacy as tools, not as ends in themselves. And third, recognize that the US can't solve Venezuela alone, it needs to work with regional partners like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, even if they don't share Washington's priorities. This isn't about surrendering to Maduro. It's about recognizing that the world has changed, and the US needs to change with it. The era of unipolar dominance is over. The question is whether the US can adapt to a world where it's still a superpower, but no longer the only one. Let me leave you with this thought. In 1979, when the Sandinistas took power in Nicaragua, the US spent the next decade trying to overthrow them. It failed. Today, Nicaragua is still poor, still authoritarian, but it's not a threat to US interests. The US eventually learned to live with the Sandinistas. It can learn to live with Maduro too. The alternative, a Venezuela that collapses into chaos, is far worse. The US can't control Venezuela, but it can still shape the outcome. The question is whether it has the wisdom to try.